on a trip and explain about the medicinal flora of South Africa, and then we will go into some of the plants that are at the Arden. And I hope this microphone is working okay. Okay. All right. So, to start off with, I just want us to think about what a treasure that we have here in South Africa. We've got an incredible botanical treasure. And this, of course, is related to the fact that we sit right at the bottom of the southern tip of Africa, and this is one of the mega biodiversity hotspots that are found in the world. In actual fact, we have a large concentration of plants, and they sit in those different areas. The Cape Floristic region, the Maputo-Podoland Albany corridor, which is actually where I come from. I was born in a little town called Alice. Anyone know where that is? Great. And then, of course, the succulent Karoo. And if you look at this biodiversity, it's only here in the Western Cape that it is found in a non-tropical area. And just saying that actually gives me goosebumps. That's something really special. And so if we take a closer look to see where this biodiversity is actually sitting, that's the Maputo-Podoland Albany corridor. And of course, we're sitting right here at the bottom in the Cape Floristic region. And then we have the succulent Karoo Yellow that goes all the way through to Mapuland. And of course, our plants are very, very special. So some plants that are of interest would be plants such as Erythrina caffra. Those are the plants that are found. Can I just jump the mic?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm happy to.
Here we go.
I taught aerobics for a very long time, so I can project if needed be. So I hope the volume is okay. Yeah. Great. Okay, so Erythrina caffra that's found in the Maputo-Podoland area, and plants like the wild ginger, Saphnacalus aethiopicus, very important in Zulu traditional medicine, and this particular species is actually regarded as being extinct in the wild. And that, I think, is a problem. And so other plants that might be of interest would be the Hoodia. We know the story that happened with the Hoodia, where there was a lot of controversy in relation to Pfizer wanting to commercialize Hoodia as a way to get nice and skinny, and the CSIR got into trouble because they were not necessarily acknowledging the original knowledge holders of that information. And so some patents were revoked, and then ultimately that particular project fell apart. And so since then, the South African legislation has basically included several different chapters that protect indigenous knowledge as well as the genetic resources that are attached with the exploitation of plants for health. And that is part of the National Environmental Management and Biodiversity Act, and it pretty much stipulates that if you are going to exploit medicinal plants and use somebody else's knowledge, you need to acknowledge them if you gain any benefits. And so that's the story behind Hoodia. And then if I just point us to the quiver tree, this is becoming a marker for climate change, as it is said that its reproduction is being affected by climate change, and its range might actually ultimately shift. And that's quite problematic if we end up with changes in the way in which that species actually exists. And so now I just want to show a video just to display some of these beautiful plants that we have here in South Africa, and just to impress upon everybody that these plants grow in very niche environments. They are acutely aware of their space, and they actually change the way in which which they grow in order to be able to deal with stresses. And in places like the Tambo Karoo, there are times when it's absolutely desolate, and then with a little bit of rain, suddenly it explodes into a botanical wonderland that is full of botanical riches. And these plants are very unique in their pollination syndromes and the ways in which they exist. And many of these plants are obviously quite important because they are then positioned in gardens, just because they happen to be so beautiful. And some of the plants that I actually showed there, some of them have medicinal value and some of them are actually important because of their horticultural attractiveness. And this horticultural attractiveness has been very important to people that have come past our shores here in South Africa. And I want to take us back to the days of Pape, and he was probably the first ethnobotanist, somebody that actually recorded the ethnic use of plants in the Cape, and I would say he was thus the first ethnobotanist that came past these shores. And one of the things that he actually said was that there was an interaction between the local people, the Khoi people, and the travelers that were coming past here as part of the Dutch East India Company, and that the Khoi local people were actually quite happy to assist in utilizing the plants of the area in their healing, as people were actually getting sick on the ships. And some of our plants during these times also ended up in the Netherlands, such as Narcissus and a few other species. They ended up in the Netherlands, and this led to South African plants moving out of South Africa and into other parts of the world. Yes?
Sorry, what's his name?
Pape. P-A-P-P-E. Okay. All right. And so that brought other people that were interested in plants in trying to understand this very unique Cape flora. And I think this history is also intricately linked to the local people, the Khoi people and the San people who were available at the time. And these drawings that I actually have here are drawings of plants that were conducted in the 1600s. So it says 1612 is when some of these Cape bulbs were actually drawn. And this sparked a lot of interest in the European settlers at that particular time. So there definitely probably would have been some knowledge exchange in relation to this biodiversity, and any place that is very well renowned in terms of its biocultural diversity, together with its biodiversity, really is a place that can be regarded as having wealth in terms of economic botany. And of course, South Africans recognize this, and about 70% to 80% of our population actually utilizes medicinal plants for health purposes. And that is mainly linked to the black populations of South Africa. And you can see that here in the Western Cape, and this is, I'm just going to go back, this is Cape Town City. We have the Rastas that are the main commodifiers of medicinal plants. They do collect from the wild. You often see them with the bags, and they trace their way of healing to the Khoi and the San people. And they say that they bring lost cultures into a modern space. And then Amposa, so hence I actually included that picture. This is a picture of a celebration of Xhosa healers, Amagqirha. And this is most likely to have been in a ceremony where it was part of an initiation of one of the sangomas. And this exploitation of the biodiversity is very important from a psychocultural perspective, because people are using it as part of their psychotherapy, as well as part of their spiritual therapy. And so it really is very important to the local people, and it connects them to their history and their ancestors. And in a modern space, we need to be able to recognize that in South Africa, the exploitation of medicinal plants for health was outlawed by the apartheid government in the Witchcraft Act of 1965. And since then, there has been a new recognition that these plants are very important in actually building a bioeconomy that's attached to medicinal plants. And that bioeconomy actually stems way back. So these lemons, plant-based medications, actually are an amalgamation of two different systems: Western herbalism, as well as the exploitation of traditional African medicines. And they are still in use today and are important to the different communities that exist in South Africa. I placed this particular set of pictures just to contrast the differences between indigenous knowledge systems that actually exist. And I think if you want to categorize the different indigenous knowledge systems that exist in South Africa, you've got to think about the 11 official languages that we have. I know we also have the 12th language, which is sign language. But if you think about the 11 official languages, that relates to different ethnic identities, I suppose. And that could be at least 11 different types of indigenous knowledge systems. And the most vibrant of these knowledge systems, I would say, is linked to Zulu culture. They have the largest markets of medicinal plants, and those markets, I think, are the biggest in Africa. And I might even say that the Warwick Junction market might even be bigger than some of the traditional medicines markets that I've actually seen when I've traveled to China to go and interact with some collaborators there. And so, those markets are fed in terms of natural resources by plants that are coming from pretty much all over South Africa. And this species here, I use this as an example, the wild ginger, is no longer available in South Africa. You can't get it in KwaZulu-Natal. You actually have to hop over to Mozambique to collect it. And so that gives me the idea that possibly some of our plants and bark that's extracted from the trees here in the Western Cape is probably likely ending up in places like KwaZulu-Natal. And the reason I say this is because the bush doctors mainly utilize fern moss. And fern moss is sustainable. It's the leaves that people are using. Whereas the bark can be unsustainable, especially if the stripping of that bark is happening at a heavy load, such as in Newlands Forest. Okay. All right. Don't know why this is not working now. Oops. Just go forward one. And so traditional medicines are important, and obviously here in the Western Cape you find that the bush doctors are the ones that you are seeing that are more visible in terms of the exploitation of medicinal plants. but they're not the only people that are interacting with the plants that are probably setting in Newlands Forest and even at the Ardenne. And part of this is bringing a lost culture into a modern space. And these medicinal plants are very important, and some plants such as pelargoniums, such as Pelargonium pseudoides, this one comes from the Eastern Cape, of course, are exceedingly important because they're manufacturing products like Lintogon and products like Umka Cold Care, which is pretty much the American version of Lintogon. And the root is used to make this extract. Anybody in the room that uses Lintogon? I love it. During COVID, it was part of my COVID cure, and that COVID cure also included Tulbalgia, some rooibos, and Pelargonium pseudoides, and sometimes I would take a little bit of the Lintogon just to make sure that I was keeping myself healthy. And so, why are South Africans using medicinal plants? The reason for this is because it's their first line of healthcare. Most people do not have access to reliable healthcare in this country. And you have a much greater population of traditional healers, 1 to 500, in comparison to medical doctors, 1 to 40,000 per person. And so it's much easier to see a sangoma. It's much easier to go from your little hut in the Transkei and go into a forest and collect plants than it is to access Western medicine, because it's just not necessarily available to everybody. And so that culture is also perpetuating the harvesting of plants from the wild. And in relation to rooibos, it is probably one of the only medicinal plants. Very few of these medicinal plants are actually farmed. And cultivation is one strategy that can be used as a means to conserve medicinal plants. And so plants that sit in gardens are quite important because that also acts as a conservation strategy. Okay, so what about the research in medicinal plants? If we look at this, you can see that more research has been conducted since 1994, and we're learning more about medicinal plants since that particular time. And there are certain areas of research that have really exploded. In the past, there was a partial understanding of the chemistry, but now a lot of our plants, we are trying to better understand the pharmacology and the way in which they act in the human body, and trying to understand differences of plants that may exist in different populations. And those are the studies that are most current. And so how do you unlock an ethnobotanical treasure trove? Because that's pretty much what we have. I think it's very difficult, especially seeing that in the South African context, there are over 5,000 plants that are exploited for health purposes on a daily basis. How does a researcher then make a decision about which of those plants one should be studying? And so it becomes quite difficult to make those decisions, but one way to do this is to consult with local people, get a better understanding in terms of what they're using and what they're using it for, and which plants might be harvested from the wild, which might then likely face an extinction risk. And here in the Western Cape, we have done a study where we've actually tried to understand what the bush doctors are collecting, and we've gone to different places, and they usually tell us what it is that they are actually collecting and whether they would be interested in cultivating those plants. Okay? All right? And what's interesting is that if you look at this, much of this is not necessarily bark. They're not necessarily collecting any bark. Sutherlandia frutescens comes quite high up in terms of the way in which it's used. Agathosma, Buchu, Aristea, the pelargonium, the bulb is used, Helichrysum, and all of these plants that actually sit in this part of the graph are not used so much. But the bush doctors are mainly using foliage. And you can see here, it's mainly foliage and very little bark, 1% in terms of the bark. So I don't necessarily believe that they are the culprits that are collecting bark out of different areas here in the Western Cape. Yes, they are definitely collecting some tubers, some bulbs, and they're definitely collecting the foliage. Okay, so now I want to step into my lab in Stellenbosch, and I'm going to indicate some of the plants that are at the Ardern and some of those species that we've actually been studying. And this, of course, is quite serendipitous. And we use a very integrated approach. We go out into the field, we bring those plants from the field, and we also use plant tissue culture and cultivate those plants as little tissue cultures to assist with conservation. And also it gives us a tool where we can change the environment and give them stress. I call it the torture chamber for the little plantlets. And then we study the chemistry to try and understand why they are different. And so those strategies are some of the strategies that we actually use. We also can use genetics and genomics, and plants like the salvias, for example, these are quite important. They happen to be antiviral, antibacterial, very important as medications for colds and flus. The salvias are also very important for treating upper respiratory infections. And the extract, the essential oil extract, also gives you a very nice calm feeling. They have very interesting chemistry, and that chemistry is what we are exploiting. They've got chemicals that are volatile, and so when you smell those salvias, sometimes you get mint, you get some spice out of there, and those particular salvias are quite important, and they have antifungal activity. Okay, so Salvia aurea, I think this particular species is quite common, and it has antifusarium activity, and fusarium is a problem, particularly for crop species, because once it infects corn, it can actually lead to mycotoxins, and mycotoxins cause cancers. So if we can prevent fusarium infections, we are also then preventing cancers. Ooh, okay, so I think I need to be here, right, to be able to move the slides. Okay, now Crocosmia. When we had the evening at the Ardern a few weeks ago, my eye actually saw those Crocosmias and I was like, wow, those are really lovely. And I went to go and take a picture before we got on to drinking some wine. And so there's a collection of Crocosmias at the Ardern, and interestingly enough, I have actually been working on this particular species together with Jörg Bowman from the University of British Columbia and Sandra Ermisch from the University of Leiden. And this particular species has got anti-diabetic effects. And it's the culm of the Crocosmia species that has this anti-diabetic molecule. It's a very large molecule. It cannot be synthesized, and so in order to be able to develop that as a therapy for diabetes, we actually need to get that molecule directly from the plant source. So that meant that we went to different parts of South Africa, collecting We ended up at Hoxback, which is about 20 minutes away from my home, and we collected there as well, and that was really nice. And this year I'm actually going to get some of these plants from my mom's garden. But what was interesting is that the garden variety Crocosma crocosmiflora also has these chemicals. So the large bars, they indicate the highest amounts of the chemistry. And it's a very complicated chemistry which we are actually trying to resolve. And that looks a little bit scary, I know, but I'm going to try and keep it simple. So Crocosmia has quite a few different species, and I think the garden variety is actually a hybrid of the natural existing species. And when you look at the natural, the natural species, you'll see that they do look different in terms of their flowers, but their chemistry is also different. And it depends on where you actually are. So those burnt orange colors show more of the chemistry, and this is definitely dependent on where the collections come from and which species it actually is. So I just want to talk about Dodonea viscosa, because I think this is going to be something that's very important in the future. And this particular species has an anti-breast cancer set of compounds, and it is also anti-angiogenic. And what that means is that it has the potential to prevent the migration of the cancer from its original site.
Sorry, Max, is that also antiretroviral?
Yes. And the Dodonea, if you are thinking about using cultivation as a way to provide a resource, you need to obviously be able to have that material be similar to wild cultivated material. And so, for example, if we wanted to deal with the fact that Ocotea bullata, plants like Tertia tata, are being extracted with the Warburgias, people are bark stripping these plants. Perhaps what we should be doing is actually growing and farming these plants, similarly to the way in which eucalyptus and pine forests have existed in order to be able to provide wood and for other uses. But we need to be able to trust what we've actually planted. So we use the Dodonea as an example to try and understand what happens if you cultivate the Dodonea. And it's quite simple. It looks very scary again with these graphs here, but we just need to focus on the colors. The peach are plants from the Cedarburg. Those are cultivated. The peach at the top there, again, plants from the Cedarburg. The wild and the cultivated plants sit exactly on the same frame in the same areas of these two graphs. So that means that there are no unpredictable changes to the chemistry if you are actually cultivating. And so we have to be able to convince people that cultivated plants are as good as plants that are coming from the wild. Now, this particular species apparently is occurring in the garden from the list that I saw, as well as from the information that Paul gave me. And this would be Cutesia dentata, and it has quite an interesting history in that the word asachai actually comes from Arabic, and it was the Portuguese that had adopted this word, and somehow that particular word made it into the naming of this particular species. And William Curtis was also involved in the botanical identification of these plants. What are they used for? Stomach ailments, diarrhea, blood purifiers, aphrodisiac. And what's quite interesting to note here is that they're becoming more and more scarce. So that means that collections are going to take place pretty much anywhere where they are found. And this is one of the plants that was given to me last year. Thank you so much, Francois, for collecting some material and bringing it over, and then convincing me to do a little project to try and understand what different plant parts look like in terms of the chemistry, and if it's possible to then substitute and flood the indigenous markets with different plant parts so that this can prevent collection of the bark. And what's interesting here, again, looking at the differences in terms of the red and the blue, if you look at the red parts, upper bark, basal bark, and leaves. So some of these plants that we looked at, the chemistry is pretty much the same, irrespective of whether it is bark or it is leaf material. And that, I think, is good news. So that means that we could then convince people to use leaves or even twigs instead of the actual bark. And then I move on to Rapania, which is also one of the species that Francois brought along. And here we've got a very rich chemistry, again, volatile compounds, and look at those pharmacological effects, antimicrobial, very useful against cardiac diseases, but the chemistry of Rapania is actually not that well understood. So that's something that we want to launch into. What is interesting again is that upper bark and leaf material group together, they cluster together, that means that they pretty much are the same. They've got the same compounds. So we have quite a lot of work to do here in trying to make this information available to others. I would even say expand on the study so that we can better convince people to think about using a sustainable resource instead of the bark. So the last one that I want to launch into is the ilex. Colds, coughs, digestive issues, some molecules that are very complicated, and again, the resource here is important for accessing those molecules. And it again has a very long history in terms of making spokes, being used for wagons. And what I thought was quite interesting was that there's only one species in Africa, and the center of diversity happens to be elsewhere. It is very important, and this graph again confirms exactly the same sentiment in relation to the two other species, in that you can potentially use other plant parts to substitute for the bark. And so with those examples, I think I'm going to call it quits, and I just want to summarize by saying that I hope that you've been able to get a very small glimpse into my world at Stellenbosch University, where we are able to utilize exceedingly introspective tools that allow us to see into these molecules. And we have a lot of work to do because many of these plants have not been fully characterized, and hopefully that will keep me in my job for a very long time. And so we want to be able to gather this information, and of course this information is strongly attached to different indigenous knowledge systems. And I think the exploitation of traditional medicines by people in a contemporary context remains a balancing act, where we have to allow people access to these historically renowned medicines that are part of their folklore, but at the same time trying to look into the future and being conservative in our exploitation. Thank you, everybody. I'm happy to take questions.